Okay, we're recording. And let me share my slides. Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Yassi Moghadam. I'm the Executive Director of International Society of Service Innovation Professionals. Welcome to the ISSIP Future of Work Discovery Summit. The topic of today is building resilient supply chains. Lessons learned from the COVID-19 crisis, and I'm delighted that a distinguished panel of experts are going to discuss this topic. And just before handing it over to my colleagues, just very quickly about ISSIP. ISSIP is a nonprofit professional association with a mission to promote service innovation for our interconnected world. And one of the elements of service innovation, one of the foundations of service innovation is resiliency in our service systems and certainly supply chains. Basically, what we do, we promote thought leadership in the area of service innovation through events like this. We have multiple innovation awards, joint conferences, workshops, and publications. What makes us unique is we have a community of industry and academia and government that collaborate in the area of research, best practices, and innovate the educational models and policy influencing. And you can check us out on issip.org. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time. Before I hand it over, I want to thank a few people. Thank you so much to our distinguished speakers and moderators. You can find their backgrounds on the ISSIP website. I'll share the link in the chat. And I want to thank the organizing team who are my co-conspirators here. And also, last but not least, our sponsors, Cisco Systems, IBM, Japan Science and Technology Agency, and Center for Business Analytics at the University of Washington, Tacoma. This is our agenda. We have a full agenda, 2 panels, and with a 5-minute break in between. Really excited to hear from everyone. And just a couple of housekeeping. As I said, the meeting is being recorded. You know, if there are any issues, please feel free to drop off. I'll share the event page on the chat. The attendees can only submit questions and communicate via the Q&A tab, not the chat tab. Only the panelists can use the chat tab. So please put your questions and comments in the Q&A session, including introducing yourself. We would love to get to know you. You can share on social media, Twitter, LinkedIn with the hashtag ISSIP. And again, you know, check us out at ISSIP and feel free to join at no cost. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Ulf Veneras, Senior Director, Aruba Networks, and ISSIP Vice President, as the moderator of our first panel. Ulf, the floor is yours.
If you can just stop sharing, Yassi, and I'll
Sure.
Start sharing. Here we go. So thanks everyone for attending, and good to meet you all virtually. So the topic of the first panel will be COVID-19 turbocharging digital transformation. And if we look on the panelists we have three very experienced people in this area. We have first Rebecca Lau. She's a co-founder and COO of Skuchain, which is a blockchain company that provides an end-to-end platform for trade and supply chain. And they also get recognized as a World Economic Forum Tech Pioneer in 2019. We're going to have Josh Garrison. Can I ask everyone that's not presenting, please mute? The second presenter is Josh Garrison. He's a Senior Director for Global Logistics at Cisco. He's got a long career in services and supply chain. Also military background. And he'll take us through the digital journey that Cisco gone through. And finally, we have Kevin Ross, a technology practice lead at Accenture. Over 25 years of experience in leadership and product operations, supply chain for Fortune 500, also startup background, and worked in a lot of different segments and industries. So what will we cover? Let's look at the agenda. So we'll have a quick introduction where I'm going to talk about MIT beer game. So we'll change the topic a little bit. Don't be too hopeful. Before I talk more about the agenda, I'll introduce myself a little bit. So Yassi already did that, but I'm Ulf Winras. I'm part of ISSIP. I'm the elected vice president this year. And I also work as a senior director at Aruba Networks, responsible for network as a service. After my introduction, I'll hand over to Josh. He'll talk about the Cisco supply chain digitization and transformation. We'll then going to go over to Rebecca, and she'll talk about the EC3 platform, inventory control and finance. And then finally, the final presenter will be Kevin, who will talk about rapid response and navigating the impact of COVID-19 in manufacturing. And then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A before we hand over to the panel number 2. So I'm pretty sure everyone is fairly eager to know what the beer game has to do with supply chain. And without dating myself, I'm going to go back to my college days. And one semester we got the printout for the different classes for that year. And everyone started to pay a lot of attention to the supply chain class, because in that schedule, it actually listed the beer game as an activity. And we, as students, we kind of figured pretty cool by the teacher to play the beer game with us. For anyone that haven't gone through this beer game, I'll explain a little bit what it is. So this is actually something from MIT, where they created a game that really exemplifies the opportunities and challenges in a supply chain. So it's like a game board where you play according to the rules, and you have the different roles of factory, regional warehouse, wholesale, and retailer. And you have to control raw materials, and you get measured on if you get overstocking or if you cannot deliver to the customer demand that's out there. And anyone that's in supply chain and you want to have a fun type of team activity, I would highly encourage this. It does not include any beer, but it gives you some really good insights. And if you look on the 4 call-outs at the middle of this slide, it really talks about the learnings from this game. On one hand, if you have lack of accurate information, it becomes really, really challenging to run a successful supply chain. If you don't have communication and you have too siloed organization and resulting in communications gap, you get misunderstandings and misset expectations. If you don't have a full understanding of constraints, like what's the lot sizing or batch sizes that you have to order in the different steps to be efficient, you also run into these challenges. And even if you have the same group playing the game over and over again, as long as you follow the rules, the typical finding is that the demand forecast that reaches the manufacturer that they go and buy raw materials for will be 6 to 8 times larger than the consumer demand at the store. At the same time, when you start to play around and you start to break some rules, you can fix this. Huh? But again, perfect team building activity. I don't know how you play it virtually, but it's a good exercise. I'm gonna switch a little bit, and my final slide before handing over to Josh is a normal day in supply chain. So if we look on the focus today on COVID-19 and what's happening with supply chain, well, it's not really the first big impact on global supply chain. And we're getting more and more global in our approach as consumers, companies, productions moving between countries and parts of the world. And if we look back 10, 15, 20 years, we had the big 9/11 attack. And prior to that, every container was seen as a trusted shipment, right? There was not a big focus on validating and verifying what was actually in that container. And over the night, it became a suspect package, and it needed to be inspected and controlled in a different way. We have natural phenomenons, like in 2010, we had the volcano eruption on Iceland that for 6 days stranded all air communication between Europe and other parts of the world. We have political policies, blockades, tariffs, strikes. And what actually surprised me a little bit when I looked into this is that the most common impact, according to a number of literature and articles that I read, the most common impact on supply chain is actually fires in factories and plants that needs to shut down. So my point and my message with this slide and with the beer game is really challenges in supply chain is not something new that just came with COVID-19. But at the same time, during the history of supply chain, with all these type of events, it is really a discipline that have benefited over the years from continuous improvements and building resiliency. But how can we use this to be ready for a long-term systemic lockdown? And what really differs in COVID-19 from these previous events is the previous events, even if it stopped flights from and to Europe for 6 days, or you have a blockade in a country in Latin America for a couple of weeks, but we haven't had this kind of worldwide shutdown of supply chain capabilities for so long that we have had from COVID. But when you listen to the 3 speakers that we have on this panel, my ask to you guys, keep this in mind, what I talked about in the beer game and the challenges that you see if you don't understand the other parties' constraints, if you don't understand the need for communication and actually sharing information, and then apply to what they say and think about how can you actually use what they're talking about to address these problems. So with that, I thank you for the attention in this introduction, and I'm going to hand over to Josh.
Thanks, Ulf. I don't know about your beer game, but in my supply chain, we do it with real beer. This is a diet ginger ale, in full disclosure, everybody. But thanks for the intro. You've got the slides, perfect. I will give you just a little disclaimer before we get going. So Cisco's got 2 supply chains, and I'm actually running the logistics for our service supply chain. So that's all the spare parts that we have pre-positioned all over the world, doing up to 2-hour replacements for for our customers in and out of about 150 countries. Very complex, just given the geographic spread that we have in terms of what we have to manage. 95% on-time delivery in and out of 150 countries is a bit something. If you want to go to the agenda slide, perfect. I'm going to hit on this, and I'm going to kind of give you the view of our digitization and digitalization strategy and how we apply that in supply chain resiliency. And I'm going to touch on some of the best practices that we've learned as we've been on this journey. I wear many hats. One of the hats is as being the digital transformation lead, and I've been doing this for about 5 years inside of our organization. And I'm going to give you the perspective of we are old now, 25-year-old. The IBM guys are saying, yeah, you got nothing on us, but an old organization and a large organization, and some of the trials and tribulations of trying to implement a strategy like this in an organization our size rather. So look, despite having a digitalization strategy in place for 5 years, I will tell you with the onset of first the China tariffs and then COVID, it really kind of accelerated the path that we were on. One of the things we did early on was really kind of define for us what did true digital transformation mean, and we came up with a couple of different definitions that are really worth sharing with each of you. And I know folks in different organizations and companies have got their own definitions here, but let me give you ours. So digitization, and I'm going to talk a bit about the foundation, is really the act of converting analog into digital. And although we are often ranked as one of the top supply chains in the world, I will tell you that we have historically been a phenomenally reactive supply chain. We are great at the dive and the catch. At the end of the day, we go off and get it done. But as many of you know, and as you can imagine, doing this in and out of 150 countries doesn't necessarily scale. So digitization is really that conversion and focusing on the foundation of your organization. There's no value in and of itself, but it is absolutely essential for building a digital organization. Digitalization for us is actually digitizing our business processes. It's leveraging the data foundation to drive automation and systemization through the business processes you use to run your supply chain itself. And then true digital transformation, we defined as really creating the culture of digital literacy, right? Both in terms of adoption by the technology that they use in the supply chain, but also adoption by our people. And the people, as you'll hear, are critical to long-term success of any digital transformation. If you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, so 3 very simple tenets to our strategy. And the first one that you see over the left-hand side really kind of speaks to the foundation, and it speaks to one of the bubbles that Ulf had on the beer game itself. This is really visibility into the supply chain. And I mentioned to you, again, very reactive organization, a very manual and reactive supply chain historically. We spent a lot of time and focus and effort in some of the basic things, the basic tenets of visibility in the supply chain itself. The physical status, where is a part anywhere inside of our supply chain? And we do this through, for us, leveraging 25-year-old technology in a Rosetta Net standard in B2B connections with a number of partners around the world. You see serial numbers there, and I'm not embarrassed to tell you that we have historically not been a serialized supply chain. But I think we recognized early on in the transformation and establishing visibility that this was core and critical to be able to not just have serial number level visibility, but to ensure that it was quality visibility. And we spent a lot of time building a foundation of many call it a digital twin. We call it our attribute data layer. And if you could see now and understand and trust the serial numbers that sit in your supply chain, we actually built a duplicate view of those by scraping and keeping up to, I think, about 100 individual attributes at the serial number level. And a very large focus for us on our financial visibility. All of this kind of forms the basis and the foundation. And again, not embarrassed to tell you that if you look to the second bullet there, the decide piece, right? Leveraging data to make digitized business decisions, intelligent decisions. We kind of skipped the first step as an organization very early on and learned some very, very expensive mistakes by investing in the promise of technology and digitizing business processes. But unfortunately, kind of skipped the foundation. We skipped the data foundation, and you'll see in some of the best practices that I share by kind of blindly believing that because the data was there, that it actually sat in an ERP system, that it was accessible, that it was quality data. And that was probably one of the biggest mistakes that we learned early on was don't assume that it's quality data. You've got to be able to measure the quality of the data here. You've got to be able to maintain the quality of the data because it is foundational to any digital transformation. And you see on the right-hand side that third bullet is really ACT, and for us that's governance. That's executing against recommended digital solutions and being able to kind of govern our business and amongst other things, data quality. This is the basis of our digital strategy. This is what we've been executing against for a number of years. And I will tell you, in an organization the size of ours and as old as ours, not the easiest thing. When you go to your business executives and you're asking for multi-millions of dollars to invest in things like data and data quality and to build out a data foundation, I'm here to tell you, because I have many scars, not a popular conversation to have, because typically business leaders focus on where's the ROI in something like this. And it was funny because with the onset of first the China tariffs, and then of course with COVID, it really thrust the resiliency of the supply chain into the spotlight, and that's really where we started to get the value out of what we had created. And if you go to the last slide, I'll actually start by talking about an example of how we built off of our investment in serialization, our investment in building out our attribute data layer or our digital twin. With the China tariffs, and again, historically an organization that's not operating at the serialized level, trying to understand what parts that we had with country of origin China in what locations as we move them back to the various repair sites that we had, many of which are located in the United States, historically for us would have been a Herculean and very manual effort. But again, with the digital foundation that we had in place there, what we were able to do, what we were able to execute against systemically was not only to identify parts, again, down at a serial number level, but to then route and automate the routing and the flow of those parts throughout the supply chain, thus saving us, let's say, countless hours, but multi-millions of dollars of tariffs that would have been otherwise due. It's funny because this kind of became one of the first use cases that we had in the large investments that we had made inside of the digital foundation. All of a sudden caught the attention of many executives inside of our organization and said, well, we get the value now. This is something we need to accelerate. This is something we need to go faster on. Which kind of leads me to some of the best practices and some of the lessons learned that we've had. Not just through the tariffs and through COVID and but really through the digital transformation and our digital journey. First of all, it's not easy. Again, in investing in the foundation, which is the very critical first step for anybody driving digital transformation, there's not a readily apparent ROI. And when there's not a ROI and you're asking for money, typically you're going to get the cold hand. But it requires not only tops-down support in buy-in, but it's got to align with the people inside of your organization, which kind of leads me into the second bullet. Digital transformation, enabling digital transformation, a digital journey is not a simple PowerPoint slide that you're able to throw out there in front of an organization one time, coupled with an email from an executive in the organization. It is something that requires ongoing communication, ongoing alignment, again, through all levels of the organization. We're on this journey. Why are we on this journey? What is the value of actually being on this journey? And it's something that business leaders in the organization have got to be constantly communicating. Third lesson learned for us was don't blindly trust the data. And this is a mistake that I've seen with multiple enterprise organizations time and time again, because many times we're kind of conditioned to believe what our IT organizations, and if you've got a centralized IT organization, tells you. The data's here, the data's good. There's no need to question, there's no need to challenge. You can go ahead and move on with your business. And that's where you make mistakes like we did early on and invest in the digital technology and not actually trust the data. Don't trust the data. Don't trust the data. I don't care if you're in IT or not. Do not trust your data. You go back, you establish the quality measures. You make sure that you can see the quality measures. It's where you want it to be, that you actually have a plan to govern and to maintain data quality where you want it and where you need it to get the value out of your investments. Probably one of the biggest lessons learned that I have, right? Focus on the foundation and the foundation first. Again, you've heard data quality, and that is the foundation for all of this. You've got to have the digital foundation in place before you make those other investments. And for us, again, a key lesson learned was really driving some innovative things. So for us, really, we didn't believe that digital twin or creating a digital twin was something that was achievable, given the breadth of products and given the breadth of the supply chain itself. We overcame that. We made that investment, and now it's yielding for us huge long-term results in terms of how we actually manage the supply chain, right? And as it pertains to supply chain resiliency and dealing with the next, if you never did pronounce the name of the volcano, I don't want to hear you try. I've tried it a few times myself. Whether it's the next volcano or the next, God help us, pandemic, or the next set of pick your geopolitical crisis that comes up, if you're able to leverage this digital foundation, a foundation of data and data quality, if you're able to find proofs of concept like we did, how do we digitally locate and route country of origin China parts to avoid tens of millions of dollars in taxes, latch on to those proofs of concept, latch on to those opportunities, find that value. It's those that will get the attention of those around you, of business executives that hold the purse strings, that will actually garner the investment and that will truly accelerate any digital transformation. I don't even know how much time I have, but it was really kind of the last slide.
Thank you so much, Josh. And as Jesse said in the introduction, please use the Q&A panel. We have, after the presentations, we're gonna come back to reading up some of the questions as well and do them loud. So I'm going to hand over to Rebecca. Rebecca, I believe you will share from your laptop.
Oh, I'm sharing from my laptop. Okay. Mm-hmm. Thanks very much, Ulf. Thanks, Josh. That was a great presentation. Give me 1 second.
In the meantime, while we're waiting, Ulf and I will try and pronounce the name of the volcano. Ulf, I've heard it pronounced Farfernugan. Is that's not the right one?
You sound like a native Icelandic person. Perfect. Okay. Thank you, Rebecca.
Fantastic. Thank you, guys. Well, thanks so much for having me today. This is an incredibly important topic, all the more so because of all the supply chain disruptions that have happened because of COVID. So I'm Rebecca. I am co-founder and COO at Skuchain. We are a blockchain company that focuses on supply chain. The name of our platform is EC3, stands for Enterprise Collaborative Commerce Cloud. And the particular solution that I want to talk to you about today is called Inventory Control and Finance, which is our trade finance application. So a couple of themes that we've already hit on in terms of what's important for supply chain resilience going forward. And one of the things that you'll hear, I think, from all the speakers today is that visibility and more information from upstream in your supply chain is incredibly important. I think that for most anchor buyers, they have a very strong relationship with their tier 1 suppliers. So these are the suppliers who sell immediately into that particular buyer. Beyond tier 1, there usually is very limited visibility unless you have one of the best supply chains in the world, like a Cisco, where you've taken the time to establish relationships with your upstream suppliers and have a steady data stream coming from them. Visibility is incredibly important for knowing exactly where your goods are, where they are in the production process, in transport, how much stock is available in your upstream suppliers, so how much can you actually order, et cetera, et cetera. This became especially important this year because what happened with the COVID disruptions was for those supply chains that didn't have existing visibility into upstream, they were frantically calling their tier 1 suppliers to find out what was going on with tier 2. Why can't I get more toilet paper or disinfectant, wipes, et cetera? And because of the lack of visibility, no information was forthcoming, which means that you can't do accurate sales forecasts or make your sales. So you want information. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is exactly how you can get that data and how you can incentivize your suppliers to participate in these programs. Okay. All right. So what is inventory control and finance all about? You'll notice that even though we're a blockchain company and the solution is built on blockchain, I'm not going to spend too much time during this presentation going over why blockchain technology is necessary for this, or how is it that we use blockchain, because I think that most of those conversations tend to focus too much on the technology itself as opposed to the business value. So I'm going to focus on what it is exactly we're offering as a solution. So this is the flow of the core application, which is inventory control and finance. So if you follow the numbers here, what a buyer starts off doing is they're going to offer a financing program to their suppliers. A lot of buyers already offer this for their tier 1 suppliers. We are going into the deep tier of the supply chain. So that same financing program that goes off of the buyer's interest rate, which is generally quite low, is going to be offered to tier 2, tier 3, and further upstream in the supply chain. Okay, so a buyer starts off giving a payment commitment to their suppliers. This is usually based off of a purchase order or an invoice. And that payment commitment is visible on a blockchain network, which means that anyone on this network can see it and understand that it was authenticated by the buyer and they can trust it for financing purposes. Next, the suppliers are going to go through their normal operations process, which means they're going to be generating EDI documents based on shipments, their invoicing, et cetera. So what the upstream suppliers are going to do is they are going to offer their EDI data onto this blockchain network. The buyers are after that EDI data because it contains valuable information for their production planning. Now, the reason why we say it's field encrypted EDI data is there's obviously commercially sensitive information upstream in the supply chain. Pricing is definitely not something that you want to share with your end buyer. Otherwise, they're going to be able to start figuring out margins in the supply chain. And so whoever is sending their data to the blockchain needs granular data privacy controls so that within individual data sets, within individual documents, they can specify exactly who can see what within those data sets and documents. But as supply chain operations are continuing, the upstream suppliers are sending their data to the blockchain. What happens then is the buyer gets to see this data many times for the first time, and they are able to obtain real-time control of their supply chain as a result. So the buyer is happy that they're getting this additional visibility. So then the final step is let's close out the financial transaction. So because the suppliers are participating in this financing program, they're going to get paid early, and it's going to be at the buyer's cost of capital. For someone like a tier 1 supplier, that may not be news. They may already be participating in that, but certainly for a tier 2 supplier further upstream, it's very rare for them to be able to rely on a commitment from the buyer in order to finance early payment of their invoices. So this is a way in which we can get the buyer what they're looking for, which is additional visibility in the supply chain. In some cases, a buyer understands that because they're offering a financial benefit, they can ask for a financial benefit in turn. So they can ask for lower pricing, for example, on their goods. But from a supplier's perspective, they're giving the data, which they're doing because the buyer is asking them to do it, but it's no benefit to them. The benefit to the supplier comes from the fact that they are getting this financing. Okay. So that's inventory control and finance. One blockchain concept I will introduce here is something called the DLPC. The DLPC is what our trade finance application revolves around, but it's pretty important for adoption of trade finance on the blockchain. So what is it? Distributed ledger payment commitment is what DLPC stands for. And it's a standard format for a payment commitment on any blockchain network. So it can be understood regardless of what your blockchain network is. This is important because it allows any financial institution or enterprise to work together to get financing, regardless of what blockchains they happen to be on. Okay, this is a standard that we partnered with BAFT, the Bankers Association for Finance and Trade, to come up with, because we understood that if you have a proliferation of different financing instruments out there on the blockchain, then it's really no better than how things currently are. So we needed some way of standardizing. And the DLPC was what we came up with. So how do we use a DLPC? For those of you who are already in supply chain finance, these terms are going to sound super familiar, but I'll go through them in a little more detail. So first way to use a DLPC is to attach it to a purchase order. This is PO financing, where you're essentially giving your suppliers working capital relief. This is before they've delivered any goods to you, but they need liquidity in order to actually produce the goods. So PO-based financing allows for that. You can attach it to a bill of materials as well if you want to do deep tier financing. Sometimes a buyer doesn't want to commit to a purchase order. They want to see the goods from the tier 1 supplier shipped first. In that case, then an approved invoice from a tier 1 supplier will become the DLPC. That amount is going to be made available to the rest of the supply chain for financing. Third way you can use a DLPC is a take or pay contractual guarantee. This is really applicable for inventory financing. That's where you're actually doing buying and selling of inventory. So you're actually buying inventory from suppliers, and then you hold that inventory until a buyer is actually ready to use it. This is a very effective way to delay recognizing cost in the supply chain. If you don't have an end customer yet, then you don't need to actually purchase the raw materials. But whoever is providing you that service, whether it's Skuchain or a bank or someone else, we are not experts in selling that inventory. So we can't take the risk that we're stuck with it. In that case, we need to take or pay contractual guarantee, and that becomes a DLPC. Last thing is a DLPC can be used as an alternative to a letter of credit. This is usually how enterprises start because it's a simplest use case. You're just replacing an LC, but this is a way to get massive cost savings in terms of how you do trade finance in your supply chain. Okay, so how is ICF different from, and in many ways better than, supply chain finance as it currently is? So some of these things we've already talked about, but I'll go through the key differences again. First is always the buyer's cost of capital controls. So the supplier is not having to take a discount off of their invoices based on their own pretty high cost of capital. They're able to get the benefit of the cost of capital of a large anchor buyer. Second key benefit is that in supply chain finance, you usually go through a bank, and bank personnel will look through all the documents for this transaction. That adds time and expense. We take all of that and eliminate it, and we just use smart contracts instead, both for transaction execution and for any review of documents. Third is, I mentioned before, usually a supply chain finance program only goes to the tier 1 supplier. In our case, it always goes into the deep tier of a supply chain, and that's usually where you want more data from for visibility purposes. Last point I'll mention is inventory buy sell means that you're getting control of inventory a lot sooner than you normally would in supply chain, which means that you're mitigating against the risk of supplier bankruptcy or non-performance. Okay, so let's talk about the deep tier supply chain and how we finance it. So this I already mentioned before is the foundation is you need to assure your suppliers that when they are sending you valuable data, that you get the data that you're looking for in terms of, ETA, what's the shipment, where's it coming from, how much, et cetera. But sensitive commercial information, including pricing, amount, any sort of quality inspection reports, if that's sensitive, and in many cases also the identity of the upstream supplier, that's all hidden from anyone who should not be seeing that information. And in many cases, that is the end buyer who should not be privy to that information. The people who are sending this data, the suppliers, need to be able to independently audit that they are only sharing the data that they want to share. And that's what a blockchain enables them to do. Okay, so that's the foundation, even before we get into financing. Now, let's add the financing layer on top of it for the incentive. So this is an illustration of PO-based financing in the deep tier. So a purchase order from a buyer becomes a payment commitment, a DLPC. A bank sees that, and they can then finance the tier 2 supplier by allocating whatever portion of that DLPC should be going to tier 2. And this is a way for tier 2 to get working capital relief at an incredibly low interest rate. As I mentioned, in some cases, the buyer is not comfortable offering a payment commitment right off of a PO. They want to wait for the goods to be shipped. So in that case, they're going to approve an invoice from the tier 1, and that creates a liquidity pool where the upstream suppliers can ask for early payment on their invoices. Because the liquidity pool is backed by the anchor buyer's commitments, everybody gets the benefit of the buyer's cost of capital. So here you have a system running where essentially the buyer is getting the data that they're looking for, and the suppliers are getting cash flow and liquidity, and it's off of the same solution. So it's not multiple solutions having to coordinate with one another, it's off of one solution. So in terms of, Josh mentioned that answering the ROI question is usually top of mind for a lot of business executives, but for supply chain initiatives, it's hard to come up with that ROI immediately in most cases. So this is one situation where we're not necessarily answering ROI in terms of, you get this additional visibility into your supply chain. How much money is it going to save you, or how much money is it going to make you? But the fact that you do have a financing program attached to it, you're able to start applying some numbers. And it is pretty significant cost savings that you're going to realize just through this amount of financial engineering. Okay. Last slide here, just to let you know, this is not a concept. This is actually being used in live transactions with extensive supply chains. So you see some names that are probably familiar to you here. Mitsubishi Corporation, Fast Retailing, which is the parent company to Uniqlo. So a very big apparel supply chain, Toyota, Siemens, Mitsui, Eldara, et cetera. These are all large corporations with extensive supply chains. They're looking for more data from their suppliers, and they are willing to offer a financing program to those suppliers in order to motivate them to participate in these programs. Okay, so with that, I am going to hand it back to Ulf.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I'll remind everyone again, use the Q&A panel, please, to post any questions. We're going to go over to Kevin. We're going to give us insights from Accenture's point of view and the experience they have in this area. And then we'll go to the Q&A. So Kevin, take us away.
Very good. Thank you, Ulf. Let me get my screen share going here. Let's get into presentation mode. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you, Ulf. I appreciate that. Not sure if you heard that in the background, but the kids are home dropping something. But anyways, thank you for inviting me and having me here today. My name is Kevin Ross. I'm the Digital Manufacturing and Operations Technology Practice Lead for Accenture in the West. I have several decades in the industry focused on manufacturing, supply chain, PLM at companies like Cisco, HP, and Harman Kardon. And today I'm going to talk about maintaining supply chain and manufacturing resiliency in a time of uncertainty like we're experiencing today. As you know, the COVID-19 pandemic is creating some of the most profound disruptions that we've seen in our lifetimes, with significant operational, social, and financial consequences. It's forcing companies to understand new demand signals, rethink workforce safety, reset operations, and explore new business opportunities all at the same time. Beyond addressing the immediate challenges, manufacturers must turn their attention to building future-proof solutions to increase resilience, social impact, and value. There are 5 key areas that demand attention now due to the constraints that we're seeing with the pandemic. And these 5 areas are understanding demand disruptions, managing workforce safety and flexibility, enabling ecosystem viability, rebalancing network assets, and leveraging digital capabilities. But let me start with demand disruptions. So chances are priorities in your supply chain have changed dramatically. So for example, you're either planning for hypergrowth, like consumer companies trying to meet demand for toilet paper. You're repurposing, like alcohol distillers making hand sanitizer, or maybe you're slowing down due to dwindling demand. Since we're several months into this, you've probably already addressed near-term issues, such as confirming demand, supply, and the ability of your customers to receive. But it's important to develop roadmaps for next wave of changes, as well as prepare for short-term shocks and disruptions that you may not see coming. So for example, just last night, our county went back into code purple, driving more restrictions and lockdown. So one way to address this is a supply chain control tower. We talked about the beer game and the need for visibility in the supply chain. Ulf, what you were describing is called the bullwhip effect, right? So you overcompensate for demand signals when you don't fully understand what's happening in the supply chain. And a way to overcome that, obviously, is digitization, and a supply chain or a logistics control tower is a way to do that. So we have an example where we developed a logistics control tower for one of the high-tech companies in the Valley delivering consumer products. And this platform is able to gather data from third-party logistics providers, such as GT Nexus, for example, and use AI and analytics to better predict delivery time. And that visibility also allows you to adjust in real time. And the outcomes there in this particular example was on-time delivery improved by over 50%. But it's important to identify how the modified demand signals will translate into new opportunities. And you should launch specific individual products or projects rather to solidify those gains. Let me move on to the next topic here, which is managing workforce safety and flexibility. So beyond the basics of remote work and PPE, what can be done to improve the effectiveness of your operations workforce? Of course, you should develop flexible staffing levels, implement remote work policies, execute safe practices on site, and refocus underutilized employees. But it's also critical to develop new ways of working. So there's this very interesting aerospace example. And they were having difficulty furnishing cabins because each of the cabins had a specific configuration for each individual customer. Accenture collaborated with a client to develop a state-of-the-art digitally enabled smart glasses platform, which allowed lesser skilled workers to do the job without extensive training. So for example, the solution included real-time access to data in the cloud, barcode scanning, voice commands, and augmented reality. The outcome in this case was a 500% improvement in productivity while pushing the error rate to near zero. And then the next priority is ensuring ecosystem viability. Obviously, in a slowdown, there's high risk in your ecosystem with your partners. These risks include availability and uptime, financial viability, and security. It's interesting what you see in the disruptions due to the pandemic. So there may be changes into your supply chain and value chain in tier 1, tier 2, or maybe even tier 3 that you're not aware of. So, for example, one of our clients was conducting a traditional security audit at a logistics provider, but what they discovered is that logistics provider had changed to a different subcontractor without notification. So what that audit exposed were several breaches of their logistics security protocols that could have resulted in a serious situation where malicious software could have been loaded on their servers. But luckily in this case, the result was a failed audit, right? Since they were doing the audit, which allowed them to put correction actions in place, but it could have been much worse. So it's very important to develop maps of your supply chain from a digital perspective and keep those maps under control and up to date, so you don't end up with those types of issues or surprises in the supply chain. And then network assets. The rapidly changing demand mix combined with workforce and ecosystem availability challenges are substantially disrupting physical networks. Companies should quickly decide on capital investments and efforts to redeploy underutilized assets or to protect or to expand critical assets. At the same time, they should ensure those decisions do not inhibit future growth. There's a series of actions companies should do to provide network flexibility and resilience. For example, one of the clients we support is a multi-billion-dollar food and beverage producer with highly complex operations across 15 plants producing over 3,500 SKUs and historically declining categories. Maybe things that you'd seen on the shelf before were declining, but we're now facing demand surges due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So people were, hoarding food, hoarding supplies, and this generated massive capacity constraints and missed sales. So the approach was to collaborate with the client to identify constraints and develop quick hit solutions, which included consolidating SKUs, restarting decommissioned assets, adding additional staffing, and accelerating contract manufacturing timelines. Great outcomes in this particular case. There was over $80 million in incremental fiscal year margin for a $10 million investment. Also increased flexibility and the ability to adapt to future uncertainty, as well as higher customer service levels during the peak season and demand spikes, which was lowering the risk of share loss due to stockouts. And then finally, skip one there. And then finally, leveraging digital. I think all of our speakers so far have talked about the importance of leveraging digital in the supply chain, and linking that back to the supply chain. To the beer game. It is all about visibility in the supply chain. So opportunities for applying digitization in the supply chain abound, from demand analysis, supply-demand matching, labor skill identification and scheduling, and remote work capabilities. Those opportunities are pretty much everywhere. So manufacturers that have digital platforms in place and accessible data, and obviously high quality data, as Josh mentioned, are going to be able to respond more effectively to COVID-19 as well as other disruptions. We've seen this with one high-tech client in the Valley that implemented a data analytics platform from their contract manufacturing sites. They had built over, I think it was like 26 data pipelines to capture data that was primarily focused on product quality and reliability. But what they discovered during COVID is that data set also allowed them to get visibility into the production flow, and production availability, based on that existing data set. So just another example of how digitization is providing that level of resiliency. So just to summarize, there are 5 things to consider in this period of time. Understanding demand disruptions, providing workforce safety and flexibility, enabling ecosystem viability, rebalancing network assets, and leveraging digital. So thank you. Happy to dig into any questions. Ulf, I'll hand it back over to you.
Thank you so much to all 3 presenters. I think very different topics, but I hope you all agree with me that it's not only me that thinks it all comes back to the beer game, actually, and it's the answer to everything with regards to supply chain. So we got a couple of really interesting questions here, and I want to take one question that came in to Rebecca that she already answered in the Q&A panel, but I think if not everyone's reading the Q&A panel, I want to repeat it because I think it's so important, and that is with regards to metrics and benefits. So do you have any quantifiable metrics or benefits that you see from your customers implementing the blockchain solution?
Thanks, Ulf. Thanks, Vanessa, for asking the question. So yes, we do have some numbers here. It depends on what you're using the DLPC for, so what sort of financing you're using. But let's just say that you're looking to replace your LCs. Or you're going to ask your customers to go ahead and replace their LCs. You no longer require them to take out that sort of protection for you. Compared to typical bank LC fees, we do see a 50% reduction in using the DLPC for the same purpose of getting protection on your trade. But you no longer have to use the LC mechanism. So that is pretty significant savings, and it probably explains why a lot of enterprises like to start there. It's a quick and easy way to get rid of an instrument that is over 100 years old, to use something that's cutting edge, but also amounts to at least 50% savings for you. In terms of other supply chain finance mechanisms, so when you start to go into the deep tier of a supply chain, then you start to see significant savings, because let's say, I don't mean to pick on Josh, but let's just say Cisco, your credit rating is probably LIBOR plus like 0.01, something ridiculously low, because it's just an excellent company. Your tier 1 supplier is probably going to be LIBOR plus 2 or 3%, and your tier 2 supplier is going to be significantly higher than that. Maybe they face a credit rating of, triple B or whatnot, and their interest rate is going to be around 10%. So if everybody were to be able to get your interest rate as Cisco, that does represent significant cost savings. And what we've seen here is at least 50 to 250 basis points in savings across supply chain cost. Now, you can give your suppliers the benefit of all of that and allow them to get cheaper cash flow, incentivize them a lot more to give you the data that you're looking for. But you as the buyer, because you're giving the benefit of your low cost of capital, you can also ask for a portion of those savings.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Next question going to come to Kevin, but before asking that question, I'll give a little bit of a story so can relate this to something. So I'm originally from Sweden, and this time of the year, it's the time when it starts to snow in Sweden, and everyone would think that a country where it snows every year, because it actually snows every year, everyone would think that the preparedness to actually remove the snow from the roads is perfect. And what happens in Sweden every year, when the first snow comes, the whole country shuts down, and it takes 1 or 2 or 3 days before they figure out again how to remove the snow from the roads. And if we're looking at what's happening with COVID now, we had the big shutdown in March, and everything went into complete chaos. We did not have toilet paper or other things in the stores. And I think, Kevin, you and Accenture, you're in a unique position working with so many different clients across different industries and segments. So So the question is really, what's your view? Have we learned enough now in the supply chain and in retail stores and other functions that when we go into phase 2 and phase 3 and we facing a lockdown again, will we actually be better prepared, or will it look the same as back in March and April, or will we have this Swedish snow phenomenon?
Well, I think that's a good example, and I think we'll be better prepared. What you're discussing is the learning curve effect, which we all go through even every day of our lives when we come back to work and kind of get the computer up and going again. There will be, of course, hiccups and disruptions, but a lot has been learned so far. A lot, I can give you just one simple example, even on the end of the supply chain, right? In the stores, right? It's very obvious now that we need to limit customers to one, roll of toilet paper, not a roll of toilet paper, but one package. If you go to Costco, right, you see everybody coming in. When this thing first happened, people were literally going in with carts and taking, loads and loads and loads of toilet paper. And I thought, wow, that's really odd. Why are people doing that, right? But people were behaving in ways that were maybe a little bit more panic driven. Hopefully some of that is behind us now. And hopefully there's been, some of these, these solutions put in place. I was looking at a study the other day where it says a lot of folks are moving on the digital space from, pilots and proof of concept, right, into more industrialized solutions. But if you look at the entire, data set, we're kind of like 39% there, right? So that's kind of where the industry is, and people are moving more and more in the direction of actually implementing, digital supply chain solutions. So our improvements are there. The COVID, I'll just wrap this up quickly. COVID for sure has accelerated digitization across all industries, just because the need, necessity is the mother of invention, and we've seen just tons of new capabilities developed in just a very short period of time.
I have next question. Thank you a lot, Kevin. I think it's super valuable insight. So, Josh, I'm not sure if you can call Cisco a legacy organization, but you have a lot of experience transforming something into a digitized environment. So if you were to highlight like your top 2 things, what do people need to really think about and do to be successful convincing their organization into this digital transformation? Because it takes a lot of time and resources in play to actually make it happen.
Yeah, I mean, at the heart of it all, most folks in any organization, starting from the very top all the way down, everybody's has that mindset of what's in it for me, right? The business execs are show me the value case in making these types of investments here. Having a coherent strategy that takes you from the legacy through transformation and can absolutely illustrate the value. That's a great starting point, right? But it's funny, and it's in COVID, everybody has said this thing. It's really kind of accelerated these plans. Never waste a crisis, and we didn't waste a crisis either. And I'll be honest with you, it started with the tariffs. I'm like, this is our opportunity that we're going to seize on, because we can pull forward these proofs of concept, these things where we're trying to prove out and get the real dollars and the real investment, the real acceleration. And it thrust it all into the spotlight itself. Now, I don't wish for the next crisis to come through to continue us down that path, but the ball is most definitely rolling. So when you have those opportunities, you seize on them, and again, very, very much value-based and value-focused.
Perfect, thank you. Rebecca, I'm coming to you for the next question. I think when I listen to your session, and we have a question on the panel on this as well, and it's really about, it sounds like a super great story. The concern many people might have is how complicated is this to implement, and do you need to like flip a switch from one day to the other and transform your whole supply chain, or what's the approach from starting and actually rolling out the transformation?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great question. In many ways, for supply chain initiatives, the rollout is just as important, if not more important, than what you're actually trying to accomplish. So let's start with, how do you roll out in the supply chain? So I would say that the same methods that apply to most supply chain initiatives would apply to any sort of blockchain-based supply chain initiative as well, which is that you start with your strategic tier one partners. So these are the suppliers that you have the closest relationships with, and they have historically been willing to work with you on new initiatives. So I would start there. And then obviously the tier one will open the door to tier two suppliers, tier three, and further upstream. There are some anchor buyers that can be a little more ambitious because they're much larger and they have historically had more control over their supply chain. So it depends on your size, but I would say generally start with your most strategic tier one suppliers. In terms of rolling out just within your organization, so say you are an anchor buyer that is sponsoring this sort of initiative. So classically, it comes down to procurement, operations, and finance. I would say finance, even though their input is critical to introducing any sort of financing program, ironically, they're usually not the ones to have decision-making power there. And that's because ultimately, any sort of supply chain finance program is about the supply chain. And so your relationships with your suppliers and what is the wider supply chain management initiative that you're trying to drive, that is what the whole organization is keeping their eye on, and that's the whole reason why you're doing this. So procurement ends up being the key department for driving any sort of initiative. And then to the extent that you need buy-in from finance, I think when they see good numbers and good accounting and legal backup for implementing this sort of program, they'll go for it. And in terms of operations, I mean, that is where if you are rolling out a product, the opinion of the actual operators becomes incredibly important, because if they don't see this as being practical, or they hate the user interface, or some other aspect of the product that makes their lives more difficult, then the project will not go forward. So I would say that focus on procurement first, get their buy-in, roll out to finance, and when you are actually doing testing, that is when you really need to make operations your most important customer.
Thank you so much. I'm going to switch over to Kevin, because I think we really want to capture your experience working across so many industries, and there is another question related to that. So if you look at the industries, which ones do you feel are most aggressive or most forward in actually implementing connected worker capabilities and are working more quickly in this space?
Well, it's interesting to see, industries like, resources, upstream oil and gas, refinery, or resources and downstream refinery, power generation, and even connected mining. And if you think about it, one of the reasons is they've always had distributed operations, right? It's always been a challenge for them to get visibility to, quote, their remote workforce, right? Because they're geographically distributed. So when COVID hit, suddenly everybody was working from home, and we didn't have the face-to-face connectivity that we used to have. So you'll see those types of industries, utilizing things like you mentioned, like the in digital industrialized worker, which has features around augmented and virtual reality to provide real-time visibility through, say, smart glasses, like I mentioned. What are they working on? They can see real-time work instructions, right? But they can also get over-the-shoulder coaching from an expert who's remote somewhere, right? So you can't necessarily have those those experts in every location, but through augmented reality, you can have a virtual expert, present at any of these physical locations. So you saw it happen there first, but you're seeing more and more, players start to adopt those capabilities.
I have a follow-on question, and I understand if you don't want to answer this one, but I'll give you the options. So do you see any industries that's falling behind, that's not really taking the opportunity to address this?
It's hard to say overall. I gave you an example of maybe some of the more traditional, even consumer products and food companies. They were falling behind and maybe are still behind, but they didn't do it because they didn't think they had to. One of the things Julie Sweet, our CEO, talks about is the fact that the pandemic has accelerated digitization by about 5 years. We're probably 5 years ahead of where we would have been right now if this pandemic didn't hit us all at once. And like I mentioned earlier, this is profound disruptions. And I hate to admit it, I've been in this industry for 30 years. I've never seen disruptions at this level because it affects the entire globe. You already mentioned some of the disruptions. It might be a factory fire. It might be a localized natural disaster. It might even be an economic slowdown, but nothing has hit the world with as much impact as this hit all at once. So you are seeing traditional companies put in a position where they do have to adopt these capabilities much more quickly. And you're seeing more traditional companies start to adopt digitization and digitalization, as Josh mentioned, building it into their culture, right, at a much faster pace now.
Thank you so much. Josh, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. I have a question regarding carrot and a stick. So when you go through digital transformation, like you described, it's really good. You have the executive support, you have the vision, you invest in the systems, and then the users continue to use Excel and email. I'm sure no one ever saw this happen in real life, right? But in theory, if it happened, any thoughts on how do you actually get the users to start to utilize the platform and benefit from the implementation?
Well, the good news is it doesn't happen here at Cisco. So maybe other places, but certainly not here. It's funny because this is where business leaders become the most important thing, right? This is about people, and it's about creating a culture, right? A culture of data, a culture of digital culture, and without that, and I mean, it's a dogged, nonstop, daily focus on getting people to kind of embrace it and to live that lifestyle. And without it, you're never going to get there. You're right, because human nature, we're going to revert to what we know, into the diving catch into what we actually know what works. So it really kind of starts with the business leaders in the organization itself. But really it's an investment in making people understand the value of being the value of data, right? What it means for unlocking, untapped potential. And it's not easy to kind of comprehend that. And again, that's why those business leaders kind of need to do that translation. Let me explain to you, let me show you what this means, how this is our future. And then really carrying the message into what does it mean for you as an individual in the organization, right? Down 2, 3, 4 layers, how does this become kind of your future? And if you can create an organization that embraces that has that culture and is always in a quest for digital excellence, you're well on your way.
Thank you so much. I think we're done with the questions, and I'm just going to do a quick wrap here before we. Let me do a quick wrap, and then we're going to go into a short break before we go over to the panel number 2. So this is the agenda. This is what we covered. We started talking a little bit about the bear game, and again, the whole intention with the bear game is to talk about the facts that you learn in that kind of environment. And I think Kevin summarized this really well. The whole pandemic helped us accelerate the whole digitization by 5 years. And it all comes back to, if we don't have the information, if we don't have the communication, we will end up in this overcapacity production or lack of products to consumers that we saw in the first phase of COVID. I think Josh shared a lot of great insights in the digitization journey and what you really need to think about, both to motivate your employees to actually start to use the new platform, and also hand in hand with that, convince your executives that this is something that's worth investing in, because it's not always that straightforward to show an ROI model or a business case for the digitization on the supply chain. If someone went and presented the need to digitize the supply chain at a big cost back in January, and try to make up a potential number on the impact if that did not happen by March, no one would have believed them back in January, right? And then COVID hits and everything gets turned upside down. So again, the work in articulating the value and the risk and motivating the people that are going to use it is key for the success. If we look at Rebecca's session, it really gives insights on how you can use emerging technologies as blockchain to drive your supply chain and get your downstream suppliers to benefit on a financial side, at the same time give you insights and control of your supply chain that helps address benefits for yourself as well. And then finally, Kevin, insight from the broader industry perspective in what's really happening and what's the challenges and what's the first movers that we see in this industry. So thank you so much for the presenters and for the attendees. We will stop by, I think we're reconvening in 10 minutes. Is that correct, Jesse?
Yes, we'll start back at 4:35.
Yes.
Yeah, and I want to thank you all for a great moderation of the panel. And I want to thank all the speakers, great presentations. So let's take a quick break and be back here at 4:35.
Hey, Tom, thanks for joining back in. We'll get started here in a couple of minutes.
Okay, sounds good. It's getting a little darker out here, so I might turn on the light.
'Tis the season. Yasi, welcome back.
Thank you. Welcome back to all of you. Okay. All right. So, welcome back, everyone. So our next panel is AI and cybersecurity for resilient supply chains. And our moderator is Sunil Kripalani, ISSIP board member. And we'll hear from Tom McGugan, Jack Palmer, and Nupur Agarwal. Sunil, I'll turn it over to you. I know you're going to do some introductions, and so are the panelists.
Excellent, great. Yasi, thank you very much. So, you know, Ulf set quite a high bar coming into this. We'll see if the second panel can hold up to that bar. Ulf, are you back on by chance? He's not. I'll hold my.
I am absolutely. Absolutely.
So, Ulf, I was going to say, you know, I loved your story about Sweden having to relearn how to shovel snow every year. I live in Chicago, where it also snows every year, as you know. Unfortunately, here we have drivers that relearn how to drive in the snow every year, and I'm not sure which is worse. So.
That's a good point.
Yeah, but in any event, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to go ahead and share. Yasi, I can just take control then. Bear with me just a moment, folks. Let me know if when my slide pops up.
It's on mute. We can see it now.
You can see it now?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. All right.
We see it in presentation, in speaker. Yeah, now it's presentation.
Is this better?
That's good. Yeah.
There you go. You know, it's the joy of dual monitors. So,
yeah.
Folks, thank you all for joining what is probably late for some, and for one of our presenters is actually very early in the morning. So, Nupur, thank you for joining us at 6 a.m. your time. You're going to see the sun rise while the rest of us have either seen the sun set or we'll be seeing it shortly. So, you know, as Yasi mentioned, this panel is focused on AI and cybersecurity for resilient supply chain. So I think we're going to pick up quite nicely on some of the topics that were covered in the previous discussion. So I'll go through a quick round of introductions, and then each of our panelists is going to go through some material on their side. I don't know if Jack has joined us yet or not. I hadn't seen him a few minutes ago, so we're hoping he's able to join us here. If not, we'll certainly have plenty of time for Tom and Nupur. And then we'll have a bit of a panelist discussion followed and inclusive of some Q&A. So with that, I'd like to introduce our three esteemed panelists. So we have Tom McGugan, who's joined us. Tom is a cybersecurity specialist at Boeing Commercial Airplanes. And Tom, fingers crossed, I understand from reading the press, there's going to be some very positive news on Boeing this week. So hopefully that comes through as anticipated. Tom is also a part-time instructor at the University of Washington in Tacoma, the School of Engineering and Technology, and is the co-chair of the Cybersecurity Working Group with DHS in the critical manufacturing sector. So thank you very, very much for joining and taking the time out of your afternoon and evening to present to us. Nupur Agarwal is our second presenter. She is a research engineer for AI with IBM Research Labs in Bangalore. So Nupur, thank you very, very much. I've had the pleasure of seeing some of the material in advance, and it's going to be very, very exciting. She also has extensive experience in developing AI-based solutions for global retail companies. And given the evolution in retail that has been going on over the past few years and accelerated with COVID, as Kevin mentioned earlier, digitization has accelerated by at least 5 years with COVID. So this should be a really interesting discussion. And then we have Jack Palmer, who is the CEO and co-founder of a company called Plotly. I have to confess, I wasn't familiar with Plotly prior to planning for this session, but as I've looked at them since, they have a fascinating open source view of the world on how to propagate AI. Really, really interesting stuff. So with that, Tom, I'm going to hand it over to you. And I'm going to stop sharing such that you can share directly, if that's all right.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Sunil. And I agree with what Sunil said. We were very much a little bit intimidated with how well the last panel did. So are you guys seeing my screen okay? I'm going to go to full screen.
Yes.
Okay. All right, good. All right, well, I'm very happy to be here. I have to confess that Haluk Demirkan twisted my arm a little bit to actually be here with you and to join the panel. But I think he saw with sort of my industry experience and really what I've been doing lately about trying to solve the problems that we've been running into in the supply chain, as well as try to manage them once they do happen. I think I'm going to turn this light out because I'm a little bit too much light. I apologize. It's getting dark outside here in the Northwest, and we've had a bunch of rain. So let me go show you sort of my perspective of sort of where I sit in this, and then we can then go into what Boeing's trying to do and how we're trying to influence this, not only as Boeing, but as an aviation industry, and now very poignantly as a critical manufacturing sector, where we also actually share a lot of the same issues between different manufacturing organizations. So I'm a cybersecurity specialist. I am not enterprise. I focus on Boeing commercial airplanes. That includes the supply chain, the design, engineering, production, manufacturing, airplanes in operation, and airplane services after operation. We have the entire life cycle. And when we think about our supply chain in the Northwest alone, there are about 3,500 small to mid-sized manufacturing companies and suppliers that are addressed through the Manufacturing Extension Partnership we have here in Washington called Impact Washington. We are also tied in very, very closely with Department of Homeland Security and Department of Defense across many different levels, and now increasingly FAA, and also some other organizations we'll talk about as we go. But when we're trying to do this, we're trying to deal with issues in our supply chain, and there's only three types of solutions, or three methods of having a supply chain solution that you have to employ. That includes people, process, and technology. Those are the sources of your solution. And whenever you're trying to deal with building resilience into this issue, then that's what you have to work with. You will always have Always have just those components to work with. Okay, within the critical manufacturing sector, it's been very interesting to me, as I said, to see the commonality between Deere Company, Caterpillar, Fiat Chrysler, Boeing. We're all having the same issues with our supply chain right now. And it's because we have, as just discussed with the COVID discussion, we are moving very aggressively into operational technology and into something called Factory 4.0. Factory 4.0 means it's the rise of automation. We've got robots in Boeing that are 1.5 acres long that are building wings and operated not just by Boeing, but by suppliers who are operating on site. And from that standpoint, the suppliers are bringing their own equipment on site. They may be setting up their own virtual private networks, you know, as Accenture was talking about. You know, they may actually have their own connections back to other either cloud-hosted environments or other activities, and all that has to be secured. So it's wired and wireless. There may be your own wireless on site as well as contractor wireless that is on site, and you got to manage all that from a cybersecurity standpoint. Within my part-time instructor role, I found it very interesting just being in the Northwest and also hearing from T-Mobile and Starbucks and Costco just how common these issues are. And so they really do need to get solved. And I think we're in a unique position, not only within Boeing, but within some of these organizations to start to make some gains when it comes to building greater resilience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity risk management. I know many of you live this every day, but sort of provide a basis for that. And then we'll talk about sort of the areas that I would propose to think about in terms of areas for the solution. Okay, so many of you may know this already. I went out to one of many sources that talks about where what the concerns are in the first place. Again, if you are concerned with providing a solution, you got to understand what you're up against. So, inventory theft, yes, that includes also theft of intellectual property associated with the inventory. There's a reason why they want the inventory, because there may be IP or other data that is in that's in that inventory. Cloud access. By the way, the cloud has a zip code. It does exist somewhere. Yes, it leverages resources all over the place, but for example, the power and the connections and the security of where the cloud data is actually hosted matters, and that matters for your supply chain also. Smuggling for us is kind of hard to hide an airplane, but we would be obviously concerned about smuggling of parts. Physical device tampering, that is an area that we have gotten much more concerned about lately, because with airplanes on the ground, not flying, there is opportunity, and there's opportunity for bad guys that are trying to find different ways into airplanes. Now, when we sell the airplane, that's really not our direct responsibility, but if something happens to an airplane, we still bear the burden of the responsibility, at least in the press. And then, trusting data to a third-party vendor and Internet of Things. We're in the middle of the Internet of Things, and if those sensors are compromised, and it has happened, where safety sensors were attempted to be tampered with, you could have a safety issue in addition to a supply chain control issue. Okay, the bad guys are very good, and we often underestimate them and what they can actually do. And they work 24/7 in teams to find different ways in. So you have to keep in mind that when you come to work in the morning, they've already been working for many hours trying to figure out different ways to get into your systems. There is also a very important to understand, there will be a motivation. There is a reason why they are trying to get into your system. And it's very important to try to understand what that motivation might actually be. We have a huge number in the supply chain also, not only of vulnerabilities that have been out there for a long time, but I believe we had over 14,000 vulnerabilities, new ones in 2020 alone. And so when it comes to your supply chain, how are you going to deal with all the new vulnerabilities that are showing up as you're trying to, as you're trying to protect your production systems as well as your airplanes in operation, or any other activity that you're trying to protect. And then when it comes to all of the information that's actually here, you got a combination of cyber and physical attackers. There's maybe insiders that have access to some of your key components. And there's actually a percentage of bad actors that might very well be in your organization. And you have to account for that also. And it might not be directly in your organization, and it might also be in the supplier's organization that's coming on site. So we talked about geopolitical disruptions, et cetera, as well as sort of this background. For those of you who haven't looked at NIST Special Publication 800-161 on supply chain risk management, it is an excellent document, and I highly recommend it. Okay, on the supply chain threat analysis side, we see this this move as well towards mobile threats. And part of our mobile threat, believe it or not, has been employees on site wanting to recharge their phones on about $1 billion piece of equipment. And so this is another factor when it comes to on-site use. But yeah, the bad guys have looked very seriously at mobile, and also always bringing new capabilities and threats together that could be exploiting that. Here's the big issue, and probably one of the main reasons why I've gotten involved with the University of Washington, Tacoma, as well as getting involved with these small to mid-sized businesses, because they are our Achilles heel when it comes to primary Achilles heel, when it comes to cybersecurity risk in the supply chain. Very few of the small businesses even have a cybersecurity organization at all. If they store information in the cloud, they're very likely storing information in the cloud in an unsecure manner, or in a way that it could be tampered with. So you look at the focus. You look at what happened with Target and Home Depot, and the attacks came in through that small to mid-sized partner, and that small to mid-sized partner became the attack vector that was leveraged to actually get into your system. When it comes to compliance, we are now also dealing with a new set of standards that deal with what they call controlled unclassified information. Now, Department of Defense has been the first government organization to really focus on safeguarding essentially the entire supply chain and the pedigree of all the systems and data that are used in defense programs. However, the National Archives defined controlled unclassified information to even include export controlled information and other information that is vital to essentially to the United States and to critical infrastructure. So if you go to the National Archives, you will see a very long list of data that is in this category that will need to be protected wherever the data is stored and wherever wherever it can be utilized. At the supplier level, what does this mean? It means that if I pass a CATIA or CAD model design that is proprietary in nature over to a supplier, and if that model itself is and diagram itself is considered controlled unclassified information, then that supplier is going to be essentially under contract to protect that information on site before it gets utilized in their own design or in their update that they're going to provide to an airplane or anything else that they're building. So this is really causing as discussed earlier, a disruptive impact across all supply chains. It's really impacting a lot right now. And it's impacting also how our contracts are being written and rewritten now to address these particular needs. So the contracts themselves are going to be changed. For those of you who are not aware, you have to also disclose anything that happens that could impact shareholder value to the Securities and Exchange Commission. So if, at the supplier level, if you have a breach or you have a ransomware attack that locks down all of your data, the suppliers also have to file these issues as well with the Securities and Exchange Commission. So this has been not well known that this requirement was actually there, but all they did was they updated their guidance and they said that if it impacts shareholder value, you have to report it. Okay, going back to the supply chain and risk management. Supply chain risk management is that set of activities that are used to manage the cybersecurity risks. But that can be establishing the cybersecurity requirements for the suppliers. It means enacting it through formal agreements, such as the contracts, and we even have terms of use and on-site requirements that we have. Communicating to suppliers on how the requirements must be verified and validated. And for Boeing and many of the other defense industrial base companies, we actually use a joint venture company called ExoStar to be part of that communication with supplier and also managing the transactions to and from the supplier, including payments that need to be made. And so what Rebecca is working on is extremely valuable and important for the industry, for our industry as well. We also need to make sure that the requirements are being met through various assessment methodologies, and we need to govern and manage these activities. Otherwise, we'll have the broken chain that we show here on the picture. For those of you who may not be aware, in 2014, the NIST cybersecurity framework was actually published. It was updated again in 2018, and when it was updated, it actually did add for the first time supply chain cybersecurity as a function, and also as a set of targets that you need to have as an organization, whether you want to be just aware or repeatable or adaptive. Is not really a maturity model, but this cybersecurity framework has that. And it also helps you think holistically about identifying, protecting, detecting, responding, and recovering happening at the same time all the time with whatever activity you have going on. So if something does happen, if I have that new 0-day or the new vulnerable system that's coming in through a supplier, what are my options? What do I need to protect that might be similar to what that one supplier has? Or how do I engage suppliers as well in responding and recovering from a cybersecurity issue that might happen? In this past year, we've had two major vulnerabilities that really cause a lot of impact to our supply chain. The first was a real-time operating system called VxWorks. And the problem that we ran into with our supply chain is when I receive a piece of equipment or if I get a software update from a supplier, it doesn't say VxWorks. That's embedded in the real-time operating system. And I don't know enough to know about what's in that system to be able to pull that out and say, you have a vulnerable system, and here's the different ways somebody can get in. And please tell me when you've got a patch available for this brand new vulnerability that was just identified. The other one that came out was something called Ripple 20. And that was a set of vulnerabilities that occurred at the library stack level for a variety of different systems. both real-time operating systems and enterprise systems that made use of library stacks. And so those two things actually cause us, as I said, to really want to think again and come at some root cause analysis about what are we going to do about our suppliers and the vulnerabilities that we incur through our supply chain. So what I wanted to talk a little bit about before we move on to other topics is what can we do about it? So going back to the business critical and operational impact that we might have from a vulnerable piece of vulnerable equipment, or let's say software delivered from a supplier. One of the biggest issues that we've run into is a lack of labeling. And what I mean by that, I know more about what is in a bottle of ketchup than I know about what's in an operational piece of technology or industrial control system. And that's because we use a lot of proprietary names for some of the same, as I said, real-time operating systems that are commonly used, open source code that is utilized inside the system. I might have a web application that was built using a web application development open source tool called Apache Struts. And the vulnerability comes in as part of how that's actually has been built in the first place. And the suppliers are not very upfront about disclosing how they built what they built. And the other thing that we run into quite a bit is dead code. We could very well have old dial-up applications that are hidden inside the equipment, and we just don't know until we go in and essentially, do scans and look and see what's actually in some of these systems that we've actually purchased from a supplier. So what is it? So that means we need more cyber specific related inventories for operational technology. Generally, enterprise systems are somewhat discoverable. There's a great advantage to that. It's kind of hard to pull an airplane down from the air and do a scan. So these are the kinds of things that you need to have more information on: the system configurations and use of embedded software. We found a lot of value in participating in government and industry sponsored information sharing and risk management programs. Those have benefited us. As I said, in Washington State alone, we have Impact Washington that's helping us share information with small to mid-sized suppliers, as well as other risk management programs that are out there. We need appropriate standards, tools, and frameworks. Right now, nobody really knows what cybersecurity looks like for manufacturing. There's not even an industry standard that addresses cybersecurity in manufacturing today. It doesn't exist. Now there are some ISO standards that are basically risk management standards, but they haven't been extended to factory production and manufacturing today. And then the last thing that I recommend you think about is making sure that you've got adequate resources and funding to align with your organization's risk tolerance. When I'm teaching class, I say, okay, on one side you got Warren Buffett, and then on the other side you have Elon Musk, and your risk tolerance is probably somewhere in between that. So with that, I will pause and see if I've gotten any questions, any thoughts as well while I'm talking about this. Sunil?
I think there was a comment from Jim that says Boeing has robots that are 1.5 acres long to make wings.
Yes.
That is just beyond impressive. And we'll come back to questions toward the end. Tom, thank you very much for a really, really great presentation. And I gotta say, there's manufacturing, and then there's the complexity of building airplanes, which I suspect is a different order of magnitude. So I can't wait for some of the Q&A session that'll follow a little bit later. But thank you again. Also, a reminder for everyone, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A session. Some are being answered live, but rest assured we'll come to all of them at the end of the presentations as well. With that, Nupur, I'm going to hand it over to you, and trust you're okay sharing your content directly.
Yes, thanks, Sunil. I'll start sharing.
And I think we might be approaching breakfast time for you.
Yes, well, another 1 hour or so.
There you go. It's all yours.
Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Sure can.
Okay, okay, so I'll start. Hi everybody. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. I'm Nupur and I'm a research engineer at IBM Research Labs India. So today I'm going to be describing a case study of a large fashion retailer called Bestseller that IBM worked with in the past to improve their supply chain using AI. Bestseller is a Danish brand that owns brands like Jack and Jones, Bermuda, Only. And we work with the Indian arm of the company. Although we work with a fashion company, the learnings and the methods we develop as part of the engagement are very generic and can be deployed to other industries as well. So, as many of us might be aware that several reports have continuously claimed that fashion industry is actually one of the most polluting industries after oil and gas. Fashion works in seasons, and with the advent of fast fashion now, there could be as many as 52 seasons in 1 year. Each season sort of marks the arrival of new merchandise and discarding of the old merchandise. And at the end of each season, sort of companies are left with tremendous old merchandise to be dealt with. Despite having a lot of historical data, most of the fashion houses are not able to sell more than 50 to 60% of their products at full price, and rest go through severe markdown. While markdown is one of the strategies to sort of offload old merchandise, the strategy is often perceived as diluting the brand value and hitting the revenue. And it's been also regularly reported that companies adopt several unsustainable practices to discard their old merchandise, which could include ranging from burning merchandise to even using very cheap, unsustainable materials, so the cost of the production can be brought down significantly. So one of the reasons that the companies are probably not able to sell their products is essentially the mismatch between demand and the supply. If we could figure out what is the right product at the right location, at the right time, and at the right price, we may not have the problem of unsold inventory. So unsold inventory is a result of inaccurate demand forecasts. So in most industries, at least in most retail industries, I would say there are 4 key components. A product that's being sold, the product can be sold through any number of channels. For example, an online store or a brick and mortar store. A customer that wants to purchase that product, and the customer can purchase the product through any number of the channels. And all of these 3 entities are sort of getting affected. And there's a store, obviously. The store could be a physical store or a brick and mortar store, or even on an online store or a warehouse. And all these 3 entities are sort of getting influenced by market trends. Now, market trends are obviously having very strong effect in the fashion industry, but they do have effect in other industries as well. So market trends sort of affect what products are being created, what products are being stocked in stores, and what customer wants to purchase. So demand forecasting is the problem of actually modeling the dynamics between these 4 entities. So demand forecasting is sort of useful when done at a hyperlocal level. It is useful at different granularities, but it is most useful when also done at a hyperlocal level. That is, we want to estimate the demand of a product at a store for the next season. And the reason we want to do hyperlocal demand forecasting, since the consumer demographics change from one location to another, and the store sort of need not be only a physical store. It could be a region, it could be a city or a channel. And the output of demand forecasting generally is fed to more downstream applications like inventory management, resource management. So if there are inaccuracies in the downstream, if there are inaccuracies in the demand forecasting, the downstream application sort of would automatically inherit those inaccuracies. So although we state that we actually estimate the demand of a product at a store, the demand of a product is actually a function of the assortment offered to the consumer. So the demand of a product may change when the assortment offered to the consumer itself changes. So to tackle such scenarios, there's broadly two classes of algorithms in the literature. One are called independent choice models, where the demand of a product is not influenced by the assortment offered. And second is called the discrete choice models, where the demand of a product is actually a function of the assortment set offered to the consumer. So demand forecasting is not a new problem, and researchers have spent decades into understanding the demand and modeling it. But the fashion industry is considered more or less an unsolved problem. The reason being, the primary reason being that most products in the fashion industry are new every season with no explicit historical reference. So even if there are some historical references, external trends sort of have a very big influence on the purchase behavior of the consumer. So to make the problem simpler, in the fashion industry, products are generally classified into subcategories like staples would be, for example, your jeans, fashion and edgy products, and people try to model their demands separately. So there could be a variety of attributes that influence the sale of a product. The first set of attributes are called design attributes. Design attributes are sort of intrinsic to the product design and are fixed once the product is designed. And example of such attributes could include, for example, the product color, the product fabric, pattern, neckline, etc. The second class of merchandising, so the second class of attributes are called merchandising attributes. These attributes characterize the decisions made by a merchandiser to sell the product. Examples of such attributes could include the price, discount offered, whether it was advertised, whether it was promoted, etc. And these decisions can typically be intervened during the season also and can change the values. The third category of attributes are sort of defined by analyzing the competition. Is my competitor carrying a similar product, and at what price? Is one such example. The fourth category of attributes are sort of related to trend-driven. Features of a product that are derived from extrinsic fashion trend analysis and forecast. But in the case of fashion, and especially when people are buying fashion online, the product images themselves play a big role in influencing sales. Okay, so in general, any attribute can be included in modeling demand for a product, and the accuracy of the model, the accuracy of the AI model would depend upon the richness of the attributes available. Since a lot of products are new in the fashion industry every season, and we do not have historical sales reference to do any demand forecasting, we rely on something called attribute-based demand forecasting for a product. Product is represented by a set of attributes that describe the product. These set of attributes could be any of the features we just talked about. These attributes could be human interpretable, for example, color, pattern, etc. Or these attributes could be complex embeddings derived from a neural network-based architecture. Then we sort of model the demand as a function of these attributes. And so far we have not talked about what is measuring demand even mean. Demand is what we call like a latent variable. It's actually very hard to measure what a true demand is. So researchers tend to use proxies. And the two commonly used proxies for measuring demand are sales and something called a sell-through rate. Sales is basically the number of the units sold in the past, and sell-through rate is sort of percentage of units sold. Because sales do not capture how many inventory we started with, so sell-through rate is sort of a more normalized number, is how many units, what is the percentage of units we end up selling. Sorry. So the prediction that comes out of any machine learning based model, the biggest drawback of that prediction is sort of the black box nature of it. And the black box nature of the machine learning models also hinders in the adoption of AI based tools. So, for example, our discussions with various merchandisers within the Bessel organization reveal that while they would like a machine learning based prediction, especially to check their gut feeling, they would also like to understand that prediction. In sort of, in a more English statement, I would say that the ability to understand prediction in terms of its input variable. And this area of machine learning is sort of broadly called explainable machine learning. And to give you an example, let's consider this scenario. 4 people are sort of working on a project. Once project gets completed, each person gets a reward based on his or her contributions. And the method of quantitatively measuring the contribution of each person and giving a bonus equivalent to their contribution is the same problem as understanding the contribution of each input to its prediction. So in the example that we are showing here, the predicted sell-through rate for this top is 0.59, which means that we are expected to sell 59% of the inventory. And each feature, for example, whether it's a neckline or color or price, could have an influence on it. The feature could have a positive influence, or the feature could have a negative influence. In the case of positive influence, what we are saying is that the feature is driving the sales up, but the negative ones are the ones driving the sales down. But the sum of the total influence has to come at 0.59 because that's the predicted value. Okay, so the ones marked in blue, we are our positive features, and the ones marked in red are our negative features. In a more technical sense, this strategy of assigning contributions to different attributes is called something called Shapley analysis, which is sort of a game theoretic way of assigning contributions to different players in a game. Okay. So these explanations, right? Whenever we have a machine learning based prediction and we have an explanation for it, these explanations should have sort of a temporal effect in it, right? Since the fashion products are, the sales of fashion products are driven by weather, we should expect that for the same product, we should have different explanations in different seasons. So in the example here, the fact that this product had a neckline of shoulders was actually a positive influence in spring summer 2019, since the season mostly overlaps with the summer months. The same feature actually had a negative influence in autumn winter when since autumn winter mostly overlaps with the winter months. Okay. So a very natural extension of this is to understand what features should I change to now increase the demand, right? And this is something what is called a what if analysis. What is the impact of a feature on the demand for this instance, right? So for example, here we are sort of showing a graph how the demand of a product would change if I change the neckline for this product. Right now, we are keeping every other attribute constant, but the analysis can be extended to 2 or more variables also. So while a tool like What If provides a very nice exploration tool to designers to play with product attributes before finalizing design, it sort of lacks the ability for the designers to know the smallest change, the little delta change they have to do into the product to increase the demand of the product. And in the case of fashion industry, this could be sometimes a color, a pattern, neckline. So this is the tool, sort of what we call Surprise Me. It's actually just an extension of What If analysis. So, like I said, right, most products are sort of new in the fashion industry. So a useful feature to demand if my product is going to do well is to sort of estimate demand using proxies. Have I done something like this in the past? And if so, how well did it do? So there could be several strategies to answer this question. What we have used is something called a visual search. So what visual search does, it takes in a product image, and just by comparing images, it comes up with other visually similar products. And the reason we are going by visual similarity, because sort of that's how most fashion products are sold. That I want to purchase that something that looks like this, right? So visually the product has to look appealing to the consumer. So finding similar products that are sort of visually similar makes sense in the case of fashion industry, but for the other industries, what similarity means would sort of depends on the product itself. So in the case of visual similarity, what we need is access to product images, and we find other visually similar products that we have sold in the past and gauge the performance of this product using the similar products we have done in the past. So I'll just take a step back here and explain the high level picture we are working on. So we are around a team of 8 folks with specialization in the area of operations research, machine learning, and artificial intelligence. And we are sort of working on developing various AI-based tools for the retail industry. And some of the tools sort of include, the goal of all of these tools is actually to reduce unsold inventory, have more sales and increase the revenue and other things. So the capabilities we offer sort of depends on the phase of the season we are in. In the case of fashion industry, there are generally 3 phases in a season. Either you could be in a pre-season mode where the designers are sort of preparing for an upcoming season, or we could be in in-season mode where we have already sort of launched products, and based on the data we have seen so far, we want to make predictions about the future. And end of season mode where we would say that, we have seen the complete life cycle of the product, and we want, based on the data we have seen so far, based on the learnings, we want to sort of improve our next pre-season strategy. So, okay. So I'll quickly take 1 more minute to wrap this up. So while having discussions with sort of a lot of stakeholders within the bestseller company, we realized that one of the key components of a resilient supply chain is sort of real-time visibility into the supply chain and the data. So we also sort of built what we call an AI-infused visual dashboard to sort of visualize historical and current product performance metrics for at various granularities, for example, by season, by product, by category, etc. And we also realized that the biggest hurdle in the adoption, the biggest hurdle in any AI-based tool is actually the adoption of it. The users should feel sort of both comfortable and the need of AI-based tools to help them in their creative process. So we realized that most designers are using something called a PLM tool, which is a product lifecycle management tool. So we built something called an AI-infused PLM tool, which sort of gives a platform to all the designers to manage the entire product lifecycle. But what an AI-enabled tool would do that, it would sort of automatically surfaces the right AI interventions in the product lifecycle, and designing, the products backed with data, backed with machine learning would help them design the right products from the start itself, and it sort of would automatically become a part of the design process. Another extension of this would be to sort of enable merchandisers to do assortment planning. That is, what set of products to stock at each store. And since the consumer preferences sort of change from one location to another, the assortment should also be localized to the preference of the consumer shopping in that area. As I mentioned earlier, right, several articles have sort of claimed that fashion industry is one of the world's second largest polluter after oil and gas. Reducing unsold inventory is just is a very small step in that direction. And with that, I would sort of like to end the presentation and take any questions if there are any.
Apoorva, thank you very, very much. That was really, really enlightening. And I certainly have some questions, but I'm going to hold them to the end if that's all right.
Sure, yeah.
Back to it, but really, really well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, Jack, are you on?
Yep.
All
Still
right.
here.
Hey, Jack, thank you so very much for joining us. So, folks, Jack Palmer has joined us, and I'm going to let Jack introduce himself and walk through his presentation. Jack, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak here. So I'm the CEO of a company called Plotly, which makes the kind of the de facto standard data visualization libraries for Python, R, and Julia. So since we make the standard software in this category, we get a pretty good perspective on what's happening in the artificial intelligence and machine learning and data science space because we're ingrained in the data visualization part of that stack. You know, Plotly sells into 4 major industries, one of which is companies that are largely focused on supply chain. So today I'm going to talk about what we've seen during the COVID crisis, you know, having the perspective of most of the data science community and these large supply chain companies that had to move in a very agile way in response to the crisis, often using our software to help them do so. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I'm going to turn off my own video to preserve Wi-Fi. Let's see. Okay, everyone can see this okay?
Sure can.
Great. So as I mentioned, you know, Plotly is what people call an open core company. Other open core companies you might have heard of are Redis or Databricks or MongoDB. And people call us open core because our core fundamental technology is open source. It's free and open source. So our #1 goal as a company was to kind of upgrade the data visualization software starting around 2013 that you know, the global Python community uses for their research, artificial intelligence, data science, machine learning. So if you work at a company with engineers who use Python, MATLAB, R, or Julia, there's an 80% chance that when they make a graph or make a data visualization, they're using our software. So the reach is enormous. You know, we estimate we have more than 50 million users worldwide, and our software is downloaded more than 4 million times by new users every month. So that's the #1 goal of our company, basically provide a really first-class experience for the global machine learning, artificial intelligence, data science community as far as data visualization. And from that, we've been able to build a fast-growing company. So some of our customers in the supply chain space include Standard & Poor's, utilities like ComEd, if you include, you know, the delivery of electrons as part of supply chain, Tesla, Apple. So we had a pretty good perspective on some of the challenges some of these companies were facing as far as supply chain when COVID broke out. And I was excited about speaking here because I think that when there's a crisis, for especially with supply chain, people, like, business as usual gets interrupted. So all of these companies on this screen are going to reach for the nearest tool that helps them deal with the crisis. And for software, for building software, which is a large part of most engineers' jobs today, you know, the nearest tool, the most readily available tool is going to be open source. You might not have time to go through a procurement cycle. You might just need to start building something that tells you or tells your executives about what's going on, or helps you adjust to this new world order as fast as possible. So it's 2020, we saw an enormous increase in open source downloads for our software. You know, almost an order of magnitude for some of our libraries. And I really think this is because when a crisis occurs, you know, engineers who are responding to that crisis reach for the closest available tool. And for software, that's often open source because it's free. You can just download it. If you're a good software engineer, you can be up and running, you know, that day with something that you can start to build with without going through a procurement cycle. And there's some really interesting articles from Red Hat and a couple other open source giants about how during the 2009 recession and crisis, they saw something really similar. A lot of companies had to build new systems really quickly, and they turned to open source. And I think another part of that trend is large companies' budgets close up in times of crisis because people don't know what's going on. People are going into a mode of conservation. So open source at that time seems like a safe bet. You know, you want to minimize budget, and you want to keep as much staff as you think you can afford on hand. And you know, if people think they can protect their jobs by building with free and open source technology versus something that's about to go through a really expensive procurement cycle, then that might be a better option for that individual in the company. Oops. So as I mentioned, you know, the open source artificial intelligence software space is extremely vast, and Plotly focuses on a very thin layer of that, which is kind of data visualization and communication of these models and these results. So we're what some people call human in the loop AI. A lot of software out there is for artificial intelligence or machine learning is kind of computer to computer AI. You're writing a model with an API that is going to talk to another server that needs to get that model results, and that server might be talking to another server or a client. And I think that most artificial intelligence and machine learning software development today is for kind of server to server, you know, server to client, computer to computer AI. It's computers talking to other computers. Plotly, on the other hand, because we're, you know, fundamentally a data visualization company and an open source phenomenon, you know, we're focused on human in the loop AI. So how do you get these machine learning results or artificial intelligence models in front of the eyeballs of decision makers, executives, factory floor technicians? How do you get these machine learning model results in front of them in a way that lets them make informed decisions, explains kind of how the AI or machine learning model got to its result, and becomes part of the business that way? So in a sense, we come in at the last mile of a data science project or the last mile of an artificial intelligence project. Oftentimes, by the time we talk to kind of a supply chain giant, they've already spent a year or a couple of years with a team of data scientists developing a model, whether it's a natural language processing model, computer vision model, predictive model, sort of in a lab, if you will. And once they find that the model's successful and it has potential to deliver some kind of business value, then that's when they need some type of visualization solution to integrate that model into the business so that business operators can have access to it, and in this kind of advanced analytics technology can be put in the hands of business operators. So that's basically where we fit into the stack. And I'll give a couple examples, kind of real world supply chain examples in a second. So this is actually a good example. You know, this is a mining company out in the field. You know, they're on satellite internet, running a bunch of Dash applications in their field. This is a Dash application that a customer created to scrape various fashion styles from competitor websites. So each night, this Dash application, it goes online and it scrapes fashion styles from H&M and Zara's and Simon's and about 30 other companies that are competitive to this company. It pulls those images down, it does some computer vision on them, it does some aggregation, and then the executives at this clothing company, when a designer, an in-house designer or stylist comes to them and says, hey, I think cheetah print is really on trend, they can kind of go into this tool and verify that in a quantitative way. So this is kind of a neat example for how an advanced Python model, which ran really well on a laptop in a terminal, got operationalized through a Dash user interface in an open source Python library to a level where an executive can actually action on it. And to the executive, they don't, executives at this company, they don't even know what Python is. They don't really care about the innards, but this is a good example of the types of software tools we build to bring these models to light at a business decision level. And this is also a good supply chain example, and I can't believe that I got positioned after the last speaker and have this example, because this company, they used to sell to brick and mortar stores. Post-COVID, they decided to go entirely online, not surprisingly, and they engaged us and invested a lot more in this tool to make sure they were making the right investments for their online inventory.
Hey, Jack, a little bit of serendipity. Nipur just put up in the chat session that they actually use Plotly. So there you go.
That's awesome.
Let's work out.
That makes my day. That's what it's all about. Okay, this is another great kind of customer example, not so much supply chain, but predictive maintenance. This company, Porsche, they use Dash to do predictive maintenance on brake assemblies and run models that are very accessible with software like MATLAB or Python, but are difficult to get in front of an executive or a decision maker. Like an executive at Porsche is not going to download MATLAB or run a Python script, but this Porsche engineer can send a link to this Dash application, and a business person can kind of tweak the parameters in this pretty sophisticated model and get visual results and kind of understand what the engineering team is doing through this. So again, really good example of advanced Python analytics that is kind of beyond the ability of a traditional like BI tool, but otherwise is hard to get in the hands of a business user without building, an entirely full stack application. This is another good Dash user and customer. The Apple Care division of Apple uses Dash for different kind of predictive maintenance and supply chain applications, and you can see they've got it in Apple brand here, and they've got it. It was very important to them. Everything works on iPhone and tablets because all their executives, only use tablets. And this particular app is predicts for battery failure on devices, and they had a really great model for doing these kinds of predictions. So running battery tests on devices at Apple stores and before they're shipped in boxes, and they have just obviously billions of points of data, and have been able to kind of trace back warning indicators about batteries on devices that might be problematic. So again, another good example of a kind of Python AI or machine learning model that was just sort of living on, a really smart Apple engineer's laptop, wasn't really able, and wasn't in the hands of executives. So this was a good success story where, they actually presented it at an internal Apple event, and before that, it was just kind of the results of an engineer's model that probably just went into a keynote presentation, but now it's interactive, and people can play with this model through a Dash user interface. Another good supply chain example of operationalizing a Python-based supply chain model. This was a demo we made for a Canadian grocer, Loblaws, and we did a little project for them on demand transference. So say a Loblaws grocer is out of a certain kind of yogurt. This Python model told the grocer what the best item to restock was. So out of Yoplait yogurt, then you should restock with this other type of yogurt, which is a area of supply chain I didn't know about called demand transference. So kind of another good example of a Python model that needed to get kind of elevated and operationalized through a visual user interface to kind of more of an operator, business operator level. Last example here, this one more specifically COVID related. We did a little project with NVIDIA, who's a Plotly board member. When COVID broke out, we took a look at what COVID related data is so large that it can only be effectively visualized in GPU memory, which is of course NVIDIA's sweet spot. So we took a look at the last US census data, which is a little more than 300 million US households. And then we overlaid that with US hospital locations and the most recent COVID outbreak data, and we open sourced it. So it's just available to anyone who knows Python and is interested in kind of this granularity of data. So this was interesting because just the kind of sheer size, the sheer volume of the data set, this would pretty easily choke a BI tool, but performed extremely well in GPU memory. And it's kind of a high performance computing stack that you really need something like Python for. And NVIDIA wrote a pretty nice open source visual portal to it. So I just showed six examples of AI applications that were built in Python using Plotly's open source software. And if that particular library is called Dash. So Plotly's Dash library is our most popular library, and it's what we mainly focus our development effort on. And if you don't have something like Dash, then companies typically operationalize models like these through a full stack development process. And that requires a full stack development team. And if you're not familiar with full stack development, this is the typical team structure. You need front-end engineers who are working in JavaScript. So these are the people that are essentially making the website and the user interface. You need back-end engineers who are writing all the web server code that's going to serve the web page. And then you need your data scientists who are writing the models and gathering the data and working with the back-end engineers to plug these models into the web server backend so that they can, ultimately be served to the end user through this full stack website. So we see this a lot, and this is this sort of structure is our main competition. So we'll go into a company like Tesla, for example, and they're building, all these incredible in-house tools for computer vision, object classification, and they have, some of the world's best data scientists and machine learning researchers in those, in that field, developing full stack applications. And if you've built a full stack application, it's a lot of work, and you either need to have a very large team like this, or you need to have a pretty wide skill set and a lot of time, because you're going to spend a lot of time writing JavaScript code, working with a web server, coming up with an API, all these things you need to do to build essentially an internal website, a full internal web platform. So the goal of our company really, and our open source software, is to collapse this team and collapse this kind of very slow, laborious, expensive process to something that just the data scientists can do. So instead of needing to know JavaScript, web servers, APIs, all this other cruft, with our open source software, the goal of the project and the goal of the company is that data scientists and machine learning researchers can make these websites themselves, only knowing Python, only knowing R, or only knowing Julia, or only knowing MATLAB. Because if you're an engineer, it's very unlikely, unless you're a computer science engineer, that you learned anything about JavaScript or building websites. And even if you do know how to do that, it's probably a waste of your time compared to doing your core fundamental work of developing the AI model and making sure it's successful for the business. So this is kind of the whole idea of Dash, our main open source library, and all the examples I showed earlier, were built entirely by data scientists that only knew Python. They didn't know anything else about the web stack. So, we're hoping to create a much, much faster development cycle with this team versus this team. Because in this scenario, which we see at a lot of companies, if the data scientist wants to make a change to the model, they kind of have to coordinate with the rest of this team, which is possible, but it might take a week to make that change. Whereas in this scenario, the data scientist is a one-stop shop. They can make a change to the model, deploy it, and that's it. It can be in production that day. So going back to how I started this presentation, I think that we saw a huge spike in open source during the crisis, especially among supply chain companies, because they needed to build things fast to react to what was happening, and they couldn't necessarily go through a procurement cycle, and they needed to use or build it or recruit a full stack team like this. I think engineers everywhere needed to work with the skills they had and get something up running. And a lot of open source AI tools like Dash are being built for that kind of autonomy and development speed. How am I doing on time here?
If you've got about 2 more minutes, if that's all right.
Okay, great. So I think I guess I'll end on this side, which is one thing that I've seen in some of these presentations is a lot of these user interfaces for kind of operationalizing AI models are not kind of the traditional dashboard that a lot of companies have been run on for a long time. They're more like full analytic applications. It's not just sort of summary statistics and KPI reporting. It's really a user interface for exploring an AI model that is then going to result in a business decision. And I think that could be kind of a fundamental change that we see over the next 5 or so years, kind of shifting from the traditional summary statistics BI dashboard to this paradigm of AI applications that are more kind of buried and exploratory and are built around an AI model rather than kind of daily summary statistics. So yeah, I guess I'll stick around for questions, and thanks for taking the time, and really honored to be invited to this and get a chance to present.
Jack, thank you. That was fascinating, and I really appreciate the use of real life examples. I think that helped bring it home quite directly. So thank you for that. So I tell you what, I'm going to switch into some questions, if I may. We've got about 10 minutes left, and I know there've been some questions in the live chat session, and then I've got some here as well. So we'll go around the horn. Jack, I'll just start with you since you just wrapped up. Given the, I'm not sure if you were on when Tom was presenting, but he did a really nice job of talking about the implications of cybersecurity. And in his context, it was more about Boeing building commercial airplanes, right? So you can imagine the implications. But as you look at your product for Plotly, how do you think about security of your libraries, given the large volume of downloads that you see, right? I mean, you're in an incredible number of very prestigious organizations.
Yeah, well, I think the organizations I mentioned, without exception, run our server software entirely on premises behind their firewall. So they either have like a hybrid cloud, like Azure or AWS, or for a company like Tesla or Apple, they're running on their own Linux servers that are on premises. And I think that InQtel, which is the venture capital arm of the CIA, is an investor and partner in Plotly, and they've made a huge investment in open source. I think partially because when the software is so widely distributed and the code is out there, there are so many eyeballs on it that depend on it that are closing security holes. So I think even in the highest security industries, there has been an embrace of open source, knowing that it's a fundamental standard for really the entire Fortune 500 and governments. So, if there's a security hole, someone is probably going to spot it.
Yeah, so it's really the open source community in steroids, right? Great, thank you. Nupur, a question for you. So, really fascinating presentation on how AI is used to predict fashion trends, right? Which I think one of the ways I was thinking about as you were presenting was you're bringing science to the art of fashion design. And that's probably a huge challenge in of itself, right? So curious question for you. As more and more fashion sales tend to move online, right? Even Amazon is getting into the business. How does that impact how you think about AI in fashion? And what I'm getting at specifically is, obviously the sales numbers and everything else are generally the same. You can get that data, but you have an added layer of data potentially, which is people browsing that you don't always have from a retail store, because you don't necessarily know what they're looking at in a traditional brick and mortar retail environment. Online, on the other hand, you have the browsing their browsing history. So I would imagine you have a richness of data that wasn't available in the past. Does that make sense? And how do you think about that?
Right. So online is a completely different problem and the challenges, because like as you mentioned, right, in a brick and mortar store, when a customer walks in, we are probably seeing the customer for the first time and we do not have any history. But when it comes to online, we can offer personalization. We already know what the customer has purchased in the past. We already know what the customer is browsing, what it's looking at, and we can offer more customized products. And that is actually an extremely important problem in online store. The reason being, if you walk into a brick and mortar store, the physical space is limited, right? So the problem is what sort of products to stock in that store. But in online channel, the problem is not the number of products. The problem is, how do you make those products available to the consumer? How does the consumer sort of discover those products? For example, if you go to Amazon.com, you'll see thousands and thousands and thousands of products, right? It's sort of the challenge is to put those 10 products in front of the consumer that, hey, these are the products you might be interested in, and hence actually increasing both, for example, Amazon's revenue and the customer's delight in the the website. So what I say, AI actually can solve use cases for both of these, brick and mortar and online, but the type of challenges, the type of problems you're going to solve would be very different.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you very much. Tom, question for you. As you think about security, we touched on the fact that building airplanes has its own level of security. And I expect you have a vast variety of suppliers, both in terms of size and range geographically as well, right? Are all suppliers treated equal relative to the security constraints and requirements that they have to fit? Or do you have different tiers? Because I would imagine a small company can't necessarily meet the same demand of a General Electric that supplies you engines.
Yeah, there are different tiers, and the tiers are expressed in what we call design assurance levels or DAL levels. So that, for a really critical component, which may also have a second or third party supplier that's involved with a really critical component, you're going to get a different look than, let's say, an in-flight entertainment system, which we care about because our customers care about it, but it will not affect the safety or airworthiness of the airplane. And I saw the chat comment from Jim as well, and I was waiting for this opportunity because I've often said, we used to worry about airplanes flying in clouds, and now we worry about clouds flying in airplanes. But at any rate, the key point is that we do have to leverage in that, and it was really good what Jack was talking about. We do have to leverage open source, and open source may be in the most critical component or the least critical component. The most important thing that we have to know about our supply chain is it in there, and what is it that's in there? Because I agree that open source is pretty good about self-policing, and yeah, there's a lot of eyes on that particular code, but not all those eyes are good eyes. And those and quite a number of attackers deliberately target open source because they can get ready access to it. So you have it's a double-edged sword that you have to understand, and you got to make sure that the processes are in place to validate that it's being updated. And when a new patch is offered, how do I know that supplier, not just Boeing, that supplier implemented those particular patches? Because if you don't have traceability over that, then you don't know if it got fixed.
Right. No, that makes sense. The other one, and this was referenced in the chat session as well by one of our attendees, is, small companies with COVID have been hit with an incredible amount of complexity and cost, right? That they can't necessarily quite work their way up to. You sort of referenced an interesting dynamic there where you said, boy, we have all kinds of suppliers, and we also have people that are getting very clever with things like mobile devices. And you made a reference in your presentation that we have people that want to charge their mobile devices at work. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what vulnerability that creates?
If the mobile device itself is compromised, it can be wormable. So if you connect even a high security system that is isolated but has an open USB port, then that corruption or malware can be implemented through that particular device. Now we've gone through a huge amount of effort to make sure that that's very unlikely, but we're only as good as that one employee who decides to do that. Yeah,
absolutely. Now, thank you for that. Nupur, one question for you. This came up in the chat session as well. How has COVID impacted how you think about fashion, right? Because people aren't getting in the stores as much as they used to. And I know you had a pretty good answer, so I'd love for you to share that with the audience.
Sure. So I think fashion industry typically has been an industry that works by bringing people together, right? They sort of collaborate in office because fashion is actually not something people can. You still need a product, right? So designers sort of work directly with vendors. They visit their factories, and that sort of was no longer possible in COVID. So it became very hard for designers to actually develop product, because when they're developing product, they're trying out different fabrics. Now they actually no longer have access to fabrics because they no longer have access to those vendors providing those fabrics. So it became very hard for the fashion industry to work remotely, I would say. However, they did the best they could. And I mean, needless to say, right, with the COVID, right, all the supply chain, the raw material took a hit since all the textile industry shut down due to social distancing measures. So just obtaining the raw material itself was a huge problem for the fashion industry. And third, this is sort of my personal opinion, and I do not have numbers to back it up, but sort of fashion became a lower priority for many consumers who are buying more utility related product and may not be spending as much on fashion as they were before COVID. So the industry in general took a hit from lower sales numbers.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Thank you. So a huge thank you to all of our presenters. I think we had an incredible variety of content that ranged from cybersecurity to AI and fashion, which, we're all part of at some level. And then, Jack, really fascinating presentation on your, how you're helping people visualize with Python all of the AI models they're creating. So I think that whole notion of accelerating development cycles in smaller teams is here to stay. So really, really fascinating.
Thank you, Sunil.
So, a big thank you to everyone. I'm going to leave everyone with a little bit of humor here for a moment. So I'm going to leave you with just a little cartoon that, adds a little levity to where we've been and, where we're going. So I think, any company that believes they don't need to digitize, I think COVID has woken everyone up. And for me, and I suspect for most of us, if not all of us here on the call, that's great. That's exciting. It's fascinating. And it creates incredible opportunity for us all. So thank you all very, very much. Yassi, I'll give it back to you.
Sure. Thank you, Sunil. Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you, Ulf, Jack, Tom, Nupur, Kevin, Josh. Am I missing anyone? And apologies if I am. And Rebecca. Yeah, Rebecca left. And thank you all for joining. Thank you for your participation. And if you want to learn more about ISSIP and these type of events, please visit ISSIP.org. And again, many thanks for your time. Some of you joined late, some of you joined very early, and we really thank you. So have a great evening, morning, afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you,
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.